Parents wanted me to become a programmer. I refused and was kicked out of the home. When I became who I wanted to be, a successful motivational coach, I bought our house back, and then, living under my parents' thumb felt like being on an invisible leash. Every day was the same. Thomas and Linda had crafted a routine for me so rigid that I barely had any room to breathe, let alone pursue anything I wanted. My entire day was mapped out to the minute, from the time I woke up to the time I went to bed. They monitored everything, enforcing a strict schedule that dictated when I studied, when I ate, and when I was allowed to have a moment of so-called free time. But even that wasn't truly mine. They always managed to sneak in during those moments, checking up on me, making sure I wasn't straying from their plan. Mornings were the worst. At exactly 6 a.m., my alarm went off, and Linda would be at my door, tapping on it to make sure I got up on time. She would stand there, waiting until I was fully out of bed before she walked away. There was no chance to even snooze the alarm, no lingering under the blankets for a few more precious moments. I'd shuffle to the bathroom, wash up, and then head downstairs for breakfast, which had to be quick. I had exactly 15 minutes to eat before I had to be back upstairs, dressed, and ready to start studying. My study hours were long and repetitive, focused entirely on programming. Thomas, my father, was obsessed with the idea that I should become a software engineer. He'd chosen this path for me years ago, and nothing I said or did could sway him from it. I'd always had other dreams, other interests, but he dismissed them all, insisting that programming was the only viable option. He'd even set up my study sessions himself, filling them with coding tutorials, practice problems, and programming textbooks. Whenever I tried to take a break, to stand up and stretch or even glance out the window, Linda would appear, her voice sharp and condescending. "Alex, focus. Do you think you'll get anywhere in life if you waste time staring at nothing?" It didn't matter that I was already exhausted, that I could barely keep my eyes on the screen. To them, rest was a weakness, a sign that I wasn't committed to the future they designed for me. For years, I put up with it, trying to convince myself that it was just temporary, that maybe they knew what was best. But deep down, I knew I wanted something different. I had dreams of being a motivational coach, of helping others find their paths and chase their own passions. I knew what it was like to feel trapped, to have someone else dictate your life, and I wanted to help people break free from that. It was something I felt strongly about, a calling I couldn't ignore. But every time I mentioned it, they shot me down, ridiculing the very idea. The worst was when I finally worked up the courage to tell them about it. I remember that day clearly. I had just finished a particularly grueling study session, and I walked into the living room where Thomas and Linda were sitting. I stood there for a moment, trying to steady my nerves before I spoke. "Mom, Dad, I've been thinking a lot about what I want to do with my life," I began, my voice shaky but determined. "I want to become a motivational coach. I think I could really make a difference, helping people find their passion and pursue their dreams." They both looked at me as if I'd just confessed to some heinous crime. Thomas leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest, while Linda just stared, her mouth pressed into a thin line. "Motivational coach?" Thomas scoffed. "And what kind of job is that? How do you expect to make a living off of talking? This is nonsense, Alex." "Complete nonsense." I tried to explain, to tell them about the books I'd read, the podcasts I'd listened to, the stories of people who'd changed their lives by following their dreams. But they didn't want to hear it. Linda cut me off, her voice dripping with contempt. "You're not cut out for that kind of work, Alex," she said, shaking her head. "You're good at programming. That's where your future is. All this talk of coaching people, it's just a phase. You'll get over it." But I didn't get over it. The more they dismissed my dreams, the more I felt the need to fight for them. I couldn't just let them decide my life for me. I had spent too many years trapped in their plan, sacrificing my own aspirations for their approval. I knew I had to stand up for myself, to make them see that I was serious about this. One evening, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I marched into the living room, where they were sitting, watching TV as if everything was perfectly normal. I stood in front of them, blocking their view, and took a deep breath. "I'm not doing this anymore," I said, my voice firm. "I don't want to be a programmer. I'm going to pursue motivational coaching, whether you like it or not." They stared at me in stunned silence for a moment, and then Thomas stood up, towering over me with a look of anger and disappointment. "What did you just say?" he asked, his voice low and threatening. "I said I'm done," I replied, standing my ground. "I'm done with your schedules, your control, everything. I'm going to live my life the way I want." Thomas's face twisted with anger. "You ungrateful little brat," he spat. "Do you have any idea what we've done for you? The sacrifices we've made? And this is how you repay us?" Linda joined in, her voice shrill and accusatory. "You don't have a clue, Alex. You're too young to understand. You think you can just throw everything away for some silly dream? Fine, but you'll regret it." They went on, hurling insults and accusations, trying to break me down. But for the first time, I didn't back down. I stood there, letting their words wash over me, refusing to let them shake my resolve. Finally, Thomas delivered the ultimatum. "If you're so set on this path, then you can do it on your own. We're done with you. Either you follow the career we've laid out for you, or you leave this house. Those are your choices." I knew then that I couldn't stay, not if it meant giving up on my dreams. I couldn't keep living under their control, sacrificing my own happiness for a life that wasn't mine. I took a deep breath, nodding slowly. "Fine, I'll go," I said, turning to leave the room. I packed my things that night, stuffing clothes and essentials into a small backpack, not bothering to take much. I knew they wouldn't let me come back for anything once I was gone, but it didn't matter. I was ready to start fresh, to build my own life on my own terms. As I walked out the door, I felt a mix of fear and exhilaration. I had no idea what lay ahead, but I knew that I was finally free. Free to chase my dreams, free to live my life the way I wanted. It was a risk, but it was a risk worth taking. Leaving Jake's apartment early in the morning felt like a mix of freedom and terror. I was grateful for a roof over my head, but waking up every day knowing I had just a few belongings, some cash, and a half-formed plan was overwhelming. The sense of freedom was exhilarating, but the uncertainty made it hard to breathe. Jake did his best to keep my spirits up, always talking about how this was my chance to start fresh, but reality had a way of smacking me back down. The money I had left felt like it was slipping through my fingers, and no matter how many part-time gigs I picked up, it never seemed to be enough. The first real moment of collapse came about a month into my new life. I was working at the cafe, juggling dishes and wiping down tables, my back sore and my feet aching. A customer had just complained about a cold cup of coffee, and I could feel my patience thinning. It was one of those moments when everything seemed to hit at once. I thought about my parents, about how they'd probably be laughing if they could see me now. In their minds, this was exactly what they'd expected. They had always seen me as weak, incapable of surviving without their control, and I couldn't shake the thought that maybe they'd been right. I made it back to Jake's apartment that night, and as soon as the door closed, I felt the walls closing in. I sank down onto the couch and buried my face in my hands. I wasn't sure if I was angry, disappointed, or just tired. Everything I tried to build felt like it was slipping through my fingers, and for a moment, I wondered if I'd made the biggest mistake of my life by leaving. Jake found me there, sitting in the dark, and he didn't say a word. He just handed me a glass of water and sat down across from me. After a few minutes of silence, he finally spoke up. "You know, I've been thinking," he said. "You didn't leave that house just to end up like this. I know things are tough right now, but you've got to remember why you did this in the first place." His words cut through the fog in my mind. He was right. I'd left because I wanted something more than the life my parents had planned for me. I wanted to prove to myself that I could make it on my own, that I could build a life that was mine, and mine alone. I'd come too far to give up now. That night, I started building a plan. I was going to pull myself out of this, no matter what it took. I wrote down everything I needed to do, step by step, breaking it down into manageable goals. I'd build my coaching business, start saving up, and one day, I'd have my own place. I needed a space where I could build my dream and show everyone, including myself, that I was capable of making something real. To make ends meet, I picked up a job at a local cafe while taking night classes in psychology and communications. The cafe was always bustling, and the regulars became familiar faces. Working there taught me how to connect with people, how to listen to their stories, and I found myself naturally falling into the role of an unofficial coach. I'd chat with customers about their lives, offering words of encouragement and advice whenever I could. It wasn't exactly motivational coaching, but it was a start, and every interaction fueled my passion further. One day, an older gentleman named Mr. Reynolds came into the cafe. He was a regular, always ordering the same black coffee and sitting by the window with a newspaper. Over time, we started chatting, and I learned that he was a retired real estate agent who had worked with high-profile clients. Intrigued, I began to share my aspirations with him, explaining my dream of helping others find their purpose. Mr. Reynolds listened carefully, nodding along with a thoughtful expression. "Alex, you have a knack for understanding people," he said one afternoon. "If you're serious about this, I might know someone who can help you out. Ever heard of Coach Mike?" I hadn't, but I was eager to learn more. Coach Mike, as Mr. Reynolds explained, was a well-known motivational speaker in the area who had built a successful career out of empowering others. Mr. Reynolds offered to introduce me, and a few days later, I found myself sitting in Coach Mike's office, trying to contain my excitement. Coach Mike was charismatic, with a booming voice and a commanding presence. He listened to my story, nodded, and leaned back in his chair. "You've got the heart for this, kid," he said. "But heart alone won't cut it. You need discipline, and you need to hustle like you've never hustled before. Are you ready for that?" I nodded, eager to prove myself. Coach Mike agreed to take me under his wing, offering me an unpaid internship. I'd help him organize workshops, handle his social media, and do any odd jobs that came up. In exchange, I'd learn the ropes of the coaching business and have a chance to observe his techniques. It was tough work, but I threw myself into it with everything I had. Working with Coach Mike was an eye-opener. I watched as he captivated audiences, delivering speeches that left people inspired and eager to change their lives. I learned how to craft a message, how to read an audience, and how to use storytelling to drive a point home. The more I worked, the more I realized that this was exactly what I wanted to do. The next morning, I woke up with a renewed sense of purpose. I started looking for more ways to expand my coaching business. I set up a simple website, offering virtual sessions and motivational content. It wasn't much, but it was a start. I spent hours recording videos and editing them, trying to put together content that would resonate with people. My days were a whirlwind of cafe shifts, online research, and filming. Every night, I collapsed into bed exhausted, but it felt good. For the first time, I was doing something that felt like it was building toward a future I actually wanted. A few weeks later, I had my first breakthrough. One of my videos caught the attention of a local community center. They reached out, asking if I'd be willing to host a small workshop on motivation and goal setting. The offer wasn't much, just a small fee and a free meal, but it felt like a turning point. I accepted immediately and spent the next few days preparing, poring over notes and rehearsing my presentation. I wanted to make sure I made an impression. The day of the workshop, I arrived at the community center early, setting up chairs and making sure everything was ready. As the room started to fill up, I felt a mix of excitement and nerves. There were about 20 people there, a mix of ages and backgrounds, all looking at me with curiosity. I took a deep breath, reminded myself why I was doing this, and began to speak. As I talked about my journey, the struggles, and the lessons I'd learned, I could see the faces in the room light up. People were nodding along, taking notes, and asking questions. For the first time, I felt like I was making a real impact. When the workshop ended, a few people came up to me, thanking me and asking for my contact information. I'd made a connection, and it felt incredible. Word started to spread after that. I picked up a few more clients, each one bringing a new challenge and a new opportunity to grow. I was still working part-time jobs to make ends meet, but my coaching business was gaining momentum. Every new client felt like a small victory, proof that I was on the right path. One evening, after a long day of work, Jake and I were sitting in his living room when he brought up the idea of buying a house. It seemed crazy at first, but as he talked about it, I started to see the possibilities. If I could save enough, maybe I could buy a small place and turn it into both a home and a workspace. It would be a big step, but the idea ignited something in me. I spent the next few days researching, calculating costs, and sketching out ideas for how I could make it work. Jake was right by my side, helping me brainstorm and offering advice. He even started showing me listings of small houses in the area, places that I could potentially afford if I saved up enough. I started visualizing what my life could look like if I had a place of my own, a space where I could build my business and live on my own terms. It was a powerful motivator, and it pushed me to work even harder. As the weeks went by, I continued to build my coaching business, taking on as many clients as I could handle. I cut back on expenses, saving every dollar I could. I didn't go out, didn't buy anything I didn't absolutely need. My focus was entirely on building a future for myself, one that was free from my parents' control and filled with the things I cared about. It was a grind, but I was willing to do whatever it took. One of the biggest challenges came when I was approached by a local company to give a motivational talk to their employees. It was the largest audience I'd ever faced, and the pressure was intense. I spent days preparing, rehearsing my speech in front of the mirror, refining my message until it felt perfect. When the day finally arrived, I stood in front of the crowd, took a deep breath, and let the words flow. As I spoke, I could feel the energy in the room shift. People were listening, really listening, and I could see the impact my words were having. When I finished, the applause was thunderous. I'd never felt anything like it, a rush of pride and accomplishment that was completely foreign to me. Afterward, people came up to shake my hand, thanking me for inspiring them, and I walked out of that building feeling like I was finally on the right path. The company paid me $2,000 for that talk, the most I'd ever made in one go, and it brought me that much closer to my goal. I kept pushing, kept building, and the more success I found, the more determined I became to make this dream a reality. Jake's suggestion about the house became a driving force, a vision of the life I wanted to create for myself. In the end, it wasn't just about proving my parents wrong. It was about proving to myself that I was capable of more than they'd ever believed. Every small victory, every new client, every moment of self-doubt that I pushed through brought me closer to the life I wanted. The challenges were relentless, but so was I. I had a plan, a purpose, and for the first time, I was fully in control of my destiny. Acquiring my parents' house through an anonymous bid was a power move I'd never imagined myself capable of. It felt strange, even surreal, that I'd be the one holding the keys to the place that had once been the center of their control over me. But it was happening, and it all started with a chance encounter with Mr. Reynolds, a local real estate agent Jake had introduced me to during one of our brainstorming sessions. We met at a quiet cafe, away from prying eyes and ears, and I laid out my plan. I wanted to buy the house discreetly, without any indication that I was the one behind the purchase. I knew Thomas and Linda would never agree to sell it to me directly, so an anonymous bid was my only real option. Mr. Reynolds was intrigued, and he assured me he could handle it. We both knew that the property was headed for foreclosure. I had a feeling that their finances were spiraling, so timing was on my side. Over the next few weeks, Mr. Reynolds worked behind the scenes, keeping everything under wraps. I stayed in close contact with him, but I made sure not to leave any paper trail that could lead back to me. When the time came to place the bid, I went all in, offering $300,000 for the house, a little above market value just to make sure the deal went through. I didn't want to leave anything to chance. The whole process felt like playing a high-stakes game of chess, and I was determined to win. The day I received the news that my bid had been accepted was one of quiet satisfaction. Mr. Reynolds confirmed that all the paperwork had been filed and that the house was officially mine. I didn't go out and celebrate. I didn't tell anyone but Jake. We kept it low-key, but inside, I felt a surge of triumph. I had done it. I had taken control of the very thing my parents had tried to use to control me. Next came the tricky part, raising the rent. I needed to do it in a way that would strain them financially, but wouldn't immediately expose my involvement. The thought of tripling the rent gave me pause, but I knew it was the only way to make them feel the pressure. I decided on $3,000 a month, 3 times what they had been paying. It was a steep hike, but I was betting on their desperation to keep the house, the place they had so proudly considered their own, to keep them from cutting and running too quickly. I had Mr. Reynolds notify them of the change, citing some vague market fluctuations and property value increases as the reasons for the rent hike. I knew it would take them by surprise, and I imagined them reading the letter, their faces contorting in disbelief and frustration. They had always been so smug, so certain that they could do whatever they wanted without consequences. Now, they were going to feel the weight of those choices. In the first month, I waited with bated breath to see how they would respond. I knew Thomas and Linda would struggle to come up with the extra cash, and I took a certain grim satisfaction in imagining them scrambling to make ends meet. Sure enough, they made the payment, but not without some delays. I kept everything under wraps, making sure there was no way they could trace the ownership back to me. Meanwhile, I made regular visits to the house, disguised as maintenance checks through a management company I'd hired. I wanted to keep tabs on them, to see firsthand how they were handling the strain. Each time I stepped onto the property, a strange mix of nostalgia and disdain washed over me. It was still the same house, with the same worn carpets and outdated wallpaper, but it felt different now. It was mine, and I could feel the balance of power shifting with every visit. In the second month, things began to unravel for them. I heard through a neighbor that Thomas had started taking extra shifts at work, trying to cover the increased rent. Linda, too, seemed to be under more stress, her usual smug demeanor cracking under the pressure. They still hadn't figured out who owned the house, and I could see the suspicion in their eyes whenever I visited, though they never voiced it. The longer they stayed in the dark, the more I relished the irony of it all. They were living under my roof now, paying me to stay in the very place they'd once tried to control me with. The new rent payment was clearly taking its toll. I noticed small changes around the house, fewer new purchases, less lavish dinners. Their lifestyle was shrinking bit by bit, and I knew it was only a matter of time before they would have to make some tough choices. They must have felt trapped, just like I had when I lived under their thumb, and there was a certain poetic justice in that. By the third month, they were behind on their payments. Mr. Reynolds reached out to them, offering a stern warning about late fees and potential eviction if they didn't catch up. I knew they would be furious, but there was nothing they could do. The house was in my hands now, and I held all the cards. Watching them scramble was oddly satisfying. For once, I was the one calling the shots, and they were the ones caught off guard. Jake was the only one who knew the full extent of my plan, and he was both amazed and amused by how well it was working. We'd meet up regularly to talk about the latest developments, and he'd always listen with a grin, offering suggestions and helping me strategize. This was our little secret, and it felt good to have someone in my corner, someone who understood why I was doing this and supported me every step of the way. The satisfaction I felt was deeper than just revenge. It was about reclaiming something that had been taken from me, about rewriting the story they tried to force me into. I was finally free, and each month that went by reinforced that freedom. Watching Thomas and Linda struggle to hold onto the life they'd built on lies and manipulation gave me a sense of closure that I hadn't thought possible. At the same time, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that they might eventually catch on. They were getting more suspicious with each passing month, and I knew it was only a matter of time before they started digging for answers. But until then, I would continue to enjoy the irony, savoring each payment as a reminder that I had taken back control of my life. Absolutely, I'll flesh out the final part with some added detail, including new episodes and interactions that will make the confrontation and aftermath even more dynamic and tense. Here we go. As I approached the house, I made sure my expression was calm and collected. I'd gone over this moment in my mind countless times, but now that I was here, I could feel the tension simmering beneath the surface. I took a deep breath and knocked on the door, ready to face Thomas and Linda with a clear, unbreakable resolve. Linda opened the door, a look of surprise flashing across her face before she forced a tight smile. "Alex, we weren't expecting you. Come on in." "Thanks," I replied, stepping inside and noticing the small changes around the house. It looked emptier, less put together than it used to. They probably had to sell off a few things just to keep up with the rent. That thought gave me a strange sense of satisfaction as I walked into the living room and saw Thomas sitting stiffly on the couch. "Nice to see you, Alex," he said, though the tension in his voice was unmistakable. I could tell they were both nervous, wondering why I'd suddenly appeared on their doorstep. I took a seat across from them, meeting their gazes with a steady calm. "I won't take up much of your time," I began, leaning forward slightly. "I came here because I think it's time we had an honest conversation about this house." They exchanged quick glances, clearly uneasy. Linda was the first to speak. her tone trying to sound casual but failing miserably. What do you mean? We've been paying rent, just like you told us to. Everything should be in order. That's not exactly what I'm talking about, I replied, my voice steady. I think you deserve to know the truth about who owns this place. Thomas narrowed his eyes, clearly trying to figure out where I was going with this. I let the silence hang for a moment before I continued, leaning back in my chair. I'm your landlord, I said, letting the words sink in. I bought this house months ago. All those rent checks you've been sending? They've been coming straight to me. The reaction was instantaneous. Linda's face went pale, and Thomas's eyes widened in shock. For a moment, neither of them spoke, as if they couldn't quite process what I just said. Finally, Linda found her voice, though it was little more than a whisper. You bought the house? But why? How? I shrugged, feigning nonchalance. It wasn't hard. I saw an opportunity, and I took it. And I raised the rent to give you a taste of what it's like to live under someone else's control. Thomas's face flushed red, anger replacing the initial shock. So this is revenge? That's what this is about. You wanted to punish us? Call it what you want, I replied, meeting his gaze head-on. I wanted you to understand what it's like to feel powerless, to have your life dictated by someone else. You did that to me for years. Now the tables have turned. Linda shook her head, her expression one of disbelief. This is unbelievable. After everything we did for you, this is how you repay us. I couldn't help but laugh, a sharp, humorless sound that echoed through the room. Everything you did for me? You mean the constant control, the ridicule, the dismissal of my dreams? I don't owe you anything. If anything, you owe me for the years you stole from me. They sat there, speechless, and for the first time, I saw them as they really were, small, fragile, and utterly defeated. They'd always seemed so powerful to me, like immovable forces that I could never escape. But now, they looked like children caught in a lie, exposed and helpless. Here's the deal, I said, leaning forward again. You can either keep paying the rent at the current rate, or you can leave. It's your choice. But if you stay, you do it on my terms. And if you're late on payments, even by a day, you're out. Thomas clenched his fists, but he didn't say anything. I could see the rage simmering beneath the surface, but he knew he was powerless. Linda looked like she wanted to argue, to beg, but she was too proud for that. They both knew they were cornered, and there was nothing they could do about it. We'll stay, Linda finally whispered, her voice trembling. We don't have a choice. I nodded, standing up and straightening my jacket. I thought you'd say that. I'll have the paperwork updated and sent over by the end of the week. Make sure you sign it promptly. As I turned to leave, I felt a strange sense of closure. This wasn't exactly how I'd imagined it, but it was enough. I'd taken back control of my life, and now they were the ones who had to live under someone else's rules. It was fitting, in a way, that they would now answer to the very person they had once tried to mold into their vision. Over the next few days, I worked with Mr. Reynolds to finalize the details. I wanted everything to be airtight, leaving them no room to maneuver or escape. Watching them squirm had been more satisfying than I'd expected, but I knew it was time to move on. I had other plans, other dreams to pursue, and this chapter of my life was finally coming to a close. One evening, as I sat at my desk, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought me here. It had been a long, twisted road, filled with moments of doubt and despair. But I'd survived. I'd made it through, and now I was free. I was finally free. I started to think about the future, about the coaching business I'd worked so hard to build. With my parents' chapter behind me, I could focus on expanding, reaching more clients, and helping others find their own paths. I was already in talks with a local organization about hosting a series of motivational workshops, and the thought of standing in front of a crowd, sharing my story, filled me with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in a long time. Jake, as always, was there to cheer me on, offering his support and encouragement. We spent hours brainstorming ideas, mapping out strategies, and envisioning the future. I couldn't have done any of this without him, and I made sure to let him know how much his friendship meant to me. In the weeks that followed, I poured myself into my work, driven by a newfound sense of freedom and possibility. I met with clients, led workshops, and watched as my business continued to grow. The satisfaction I felt was deeper than anything I'd ever known, a quiet, steady confidence that I could handle whatever came my way. And as for my parents, they kept paying the rent, month after month, never once missing a payment. I knew they were struggling, but they were too proud to admit it, too stubborn to leave. It was a fitting end, I supposed, that they would be forced to stay in a house they no longer controlled, under the thumb of the son they'd once tried to control. I'd taken back my life, my dreams, and my future. And now, as I looked out at the horizon, I knew that the best was yet to come. If you like the story, subscribe right away and listen to new stories every day. Let us know what you like the most in the comments.